Today, 27th March 2024, we are still in the aftermath of the events at Crocus City Hall 5 days ago, when a group of terrorists attacked Crocus City Hall, carried out a massive terrorist attack in Moscow, resulting in the deaths of perhaps 142 people. That is the latest death toll that I have seen. The Russian authorities say that Crocus City Hall has now been completely searched, that there are no more dead bodies there. They apparently have managed to identify all of the victims. There are still people in hospital, but it is assumed that from this point onwards, the casualty numbers will not grow much further, which, to be frank, I earnestly and very much hope is the case. Of course, those who were survivors and who were caught up in this affair will have been deeply traumatized by the experience. It's important to remember that many of them were young people attending a rock concert. I hope and assume that they're getting the kind of support from social workers, psychological workers, counsellors that they require at this particular time. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on the aftermath of the attack itself, but I do want to say a few things about the actual attack, about what happened over the course of the attack, because there's been a lot of contradictory information. We are gradually getting a sense of the whole picture. And the person who's provided us with the most information is Bystrykhin, the head of the investigative committee. This, perhaps rather more than the FSB, is the closest analog to the FBI, the American FBI. The investigative committee, however, it's important to stress, is a police agency. It does not have a counterintelligence or counter espionage or counter-terrorist role. That is the function of the FSB, which I understand also deals with organised crime. So these two agencies, the FSB and the investigative committee, are working hand in hand. They're working together. Both the leaders of both, Bystrykhin and Bortnikov, are reporting to Patrushev, the intelligence chief, Russia's overall intelligence chief, and to Putin personally. But I get the sense that it is Bystrykhin who is carrying out the lead investigation. Anyway, at the meeting which took place the day before yesterday, Bystrykhin actually a meeting which took place in the Kremlin the day before yesterday, when there were reports from various officials made to Vladimir Putin about the aftermath of the attack. Anyway, Bystrykhin delivered the main report, or at least the main public report, and provided us with quite a lot of information about the attack itself. And there's a number of points that I do want to make, because there's been, as I said, a lot of misunderstanding and confusion as to precisely what did happen. But if you go to Bystrykhin's report, there's a number of things that, first of all, stand out. Firstly, there's been claims that 7 gunmen participated in the attack. Others say 6. There were claims that 2 of these gunmen were killed on the scene by the Russian security forces. Bystrykhin has confirmed that, in fact, there were only 4, and those 4 have all been captured. One of the things that stands out for me from what Bystrykhin says is how short the entire incident actually was. We are not looking at an incident that went on for a very long time. The gunmen drove up to Crocus City Hall at 6:54 p.m. They entered the building at 7:58 p.m. and that is when they started their attack. So they waited a whole hour to make sure that the audience arrived. They carried out their attack, and then according to Bystrykhin, they left the building at 8:11 p.m. Of course, all these hours are Moscow time. So the entire attack lasted around 15 minutes. I've seen some claims that it went on for hours as the attack continued whilst the security services were caught up in a traffic jam. In fact, it lasted for all of 15 minutes. And Bystrykhin also tells us that after shooting at members of the crowd, the gunmen used gasoline, which they had brought with them in plastic bottles, and they set fire to the premises. And in fact, it was the fire that appears to have caused the largest number of fatalities, not the shooting. And I should say that there's been some pushback from one very important person, Larry Johnson, about the claim that these were well-trained attackers. He says, on the contrary, they didn't give the appearance to him that they were at all well-trained or especially familiar with the use of firearms. Anyway, they entered the building, they machine-gunned people, they then took out their plastic bottles, which were filled with gasoline, and they used that to set the building on fire. By this point, there would have been massive panic and chaos inside the building, and perhaps people were frightened to leave. The result was that people got trapped, the fire spread, there was the smoke from the fire, and perhaps more than anything else, it was the smoke from the fire that caused the greatest number of fatalities. When they left the building, they bundled into their white Renault and drove towards the Ukrainian border. Now, there's been reports circulating concerning certain comments that have been made by the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko. And Lukashenko says that in the immediate aftermath of the attack, he and Putin were in continuous contact with each other, and that at Putin's request, Lukashenko closed the border with Russia. He alerted the security forces, the Belarus security forces, to close the border with Russia in order to prevent the gunmen from fleeing through Belarus. I would have said that was an obvious and standard precaution to make at a time when it was already apparently confirmed that the gunmen were fleeing towards Russia's western borders. Some people have seized on this to say that Lukashenko has in effect confirmed that the gunmen weren't fleeing towards Ukraine at all. Instead, they were trying to escape through Belarus. They only turned and started driving towards Ukraine when they realized that the Belarus border had been closed, and that this, in effect, exonerates Ukraine of any possible suspicion that it might have been involved in this affair. I have to say straight away that this is not at all what Lukashenko has said. In fact, all the evidence and his own belief appears to be that the gunmen did not, in fact, intend to cross the border into Belarus and were instead at all times driving through Bryansk region southward towards, I have to say, it looks to me from the map, but here again, I may have problems reading maps, towards the very same area in Kursk region where there's been fighting, and perhaps also to areas in Bryansk region where there's been cross-border shelling. In other words, towards areas where the Ukrainians have at various times attempted to send, what you might call commando parties. Now, to stress, I'm not absolutely sure that this is the case. It may be that I'm misreading the maps. I often do, by the way. So I might be wrong, completely wrong about this. And of course, it may be that this is something that the gunmen themselves chose to do. They might not have had any contacts with the Ukrainians themselves. And I would say this, if I am right, and I think I might be about this, that the gunmen were in fact heading towards a part of the border where there were cross-border raids by Ukrainian commando forces, then that might explain Putin's comment that the Ukrainians, or at least someone in Ukraine, was trying to create a window along the border to allow these gunmen to cross and escape into Ukraine. Anyway, I don't want to explore that further because that isn't something that I feel very confident about. Anyway, Bystrykhin then went on to say that they drove off in this car. They were these gunmen. They were in a state of tremendous panic, whilst trying to escape. They ran over pedestrians, a family with 2 young children, at high speed. The children were seriously injured and have been taken to hospital. I hope that they're all right. He then went on to say that at some point they were detected and there was a pursuit along the motorway leading to the Russian-Ukrainian border, which, to my mind, as I said, closes off the story that they were heading towards Belarus. He says that 2 AK-74 assault rifles, over 500 rounds of ammunition, 28 magazines with ammunition, and bottles with the remaining gasoline were found and seized at Crocus City Hall itself. They'd been dumped by the gunmen there. And he then says that the Russians searched an apartment where the 4 men had lived, found fragments of fabric and tools used in preparing the attack, along with their fingerprints. And when the car was finally stopped, when the 4 gunmen abandoned the car in the wood, a Makarov pistol and a magazine from a Kalashnikov assault rifle were found in the car, and there's been a detailed, apparently, examination of the car that is still going on. And as we know, the 4 men trying to escape through the wood, the forest, were tracked down by armed police with dogs. And of course, we still have all of those reports and claims that when they were caught, these 4 gunmen were badly roughed up by the men who captured them. And there's some disturbing videos which suggest that that might have been the case. And there is various claims about things that were supposedly done to one of the gunmen's ears. I want to say again, I am disturbed by these videos. I'm not discounting the possibility that very angry police and FSB officials, well, they probably did rough up these gunmen, but until I'm confident about the provenance of these videos, which I'm not at the moment, I'm not going to comment on them. And I also ought to say that I haven't myself watched them. So just to make that clear. So 4 gunmen involved, not 6, not 7. None of the gunmen actually shot at the location itself. An incident that lasted all of 15 minutes or thereabouts. Gunmen that don't appear to have been particularly well trained or adept at using firearms. Gunmen who then fled in the same vehicle that they came to the scene in, and who were not taking precautions as they drove away, so that they drew attention to themselves and to the vehicle by running over a family and injuring 2 children. Far from this being quite as well planned and as well prepared as I initially thought, this affair looks rather chaotic. Crocus City Hall was indeed inspected. At least one of the gunmen seems to have been there previously. There's claims that he was there on the 7th of March, which is, by the way, the same day that the British and American embassies gave their famous warning. So these men knew something about the layout, but they don't appear to have been highly trained, expert jihadis, determined to fight to the death, even as they commit these horrific atrocities. And by the way, I've also had some pushback about my comment that the $10,000 that each of them were being paid seemed a paltry amount to me, given the enormity of what they were asked to do. I suggested that this was possibly a tip. One of the Duran community members from Russia, was pushed back on that. He said that some of these people from Tajikistan are indeed extremely poor, and he's provided examples of guest workers that come to Moscow from Tajikistan and the kind of payments they're happy to achieve and the extent to which those payments can actually buy them things in Tajikistan itself. Anyway, whatever, they do seem to have been paid money for this incident, which again seems to me somewhat inconsistent with these people being the highly committed terrorists that we expect to see from ISIS. So I just wanted to discuss all of this because, as I said, there's an awful lot of misconceptions and misrepresentations circulating about this affair. As I said, it was short. It was over. The attack itself was over very quickly. The gunmen don't seem to have been particularly well trained, and they did, in spite of what people say, undoubtedly flee towards Ukraine, which is suggestive in itself. Now, having gone through all of that, I just wanted to discuss a number of points that have been made specifically by Larry Johnson. And like me and lots of others, David Sachs, I believe, has made this point, Larry Johnson makes the observation that the Americans and the Western powers, in going out of their way to deny that there was any Ukrainian involvement in this affair at all, are protesting too much. Now, it's important to say that Larry Johnson is a CIA veteran, and isn't just a CIA veteran, but was at the spearhead of the CIA's effort to combat terrorism. So what he's talking about when he is discussing an attack like this, he's talking as an expert. He's talking about the sort of things that he used to have to cover in his former job, and a job that he did, by the way, for many years. And he makes a number of very telling points about the denial that Ukraine was involved, that we're getting from the West, and the insistence that this was an attack carried out by ISIS-K and only by them. And he says this: I want to comment on the US and Western insistence that this was an ISIS-K operation. How in the world did the United States determine that fact? That's a fact. He puts the words fact in quotation marks so quickly. Here is my suggestion. The people who so quickly mustered still unseen evidence to conclude that it was not Ukraine, but a team of murdering Islamic extremists should be immediately assigned to conduct a similarly expedited analysis of who blew up Nord Stream. They should be able to get to the bottom of that by Monday morning. I should say that he was writing that over the weekend. Once they've knocked that out, then they should turn their attention to the Kennedy assassination. It is about time we had some definitive answers on that. Their ability to ferret out the truth, and he puts the word truth in quotation marks, about who was responsible for the heinous attack before the attack had concluded, and while suspects were still roaming the Crocus concert facility, shooting unarmed civilians. Well, I think actually they were probably fleeing by this point, but I don't think that takes away from the point he's making. Suggests that they have some remote viewing capability that is world class. And then in a subsequent comment, which all of these comments, by the way, come from his indispensable blog, Sona 21, he says this. He refers to the insane performance at Monday's State Department press conference by Matthew Miller. I repeat the question I raised in a previous article. What did the United States government know, and when did it know it? Miller's confidence, and he puts the words confidence in quotation marks, about who was not responsible, i.e. Ukraine, is total bullshit. In my 35 years holding clearances and dealing directly with the aftermath of terrorist events, I cannot recall a single time that we had advance information about an attack that enabled us to pronounce within minutes of the attack who did not set off the bomb, hijack the plane, or shoot up the dance club. Yet Miller insists Ukraine is innocent and relies on tautology to make his case. I have to say, this seems to me true. Now, there's an awful lot about this affair, as I said, that puzzles me, but then I am not an expert. I don't know very much about ISIS-K or about ISIS itself. I've called into question the kind of organisation it is, so has my colleague Alex Christoforou, a very, very well-informed and reliable source, has contacted us and has provided some information about ISIS-K. Now, I should say that this source tends to think that it is ISIS acting alone that is responsible for this affair. At least that's my understanding of what he is saying. He's not absolutely categorical about that. Perhaps he has some doubts. But I mean, he's suggesting, for example, that ISIS-K carried out the attack, then hoped and expected that the gunmen would escape, that the Russians would blame the Ukrainians, and then ISIS-K would embarrass the Russians by making its own claim, and that this whole scheme fell apart when the ISIS-K gunmen were captured. That may sound a bit complicated, but it's important to remember that we're dealing with some very complicated people, and I don't find that an implausible scenario. Doesn't mean that it is necessarily true, by the way. But the point that this person is making about ISIS-K is that today, more than anything else, it is about power and money. And if that is correct, then given that it is principally about power and money, that does suggest to me that it could lend itself to working with third parties. Of course, there are many people who believe that, who assume that this is true about ISIS and has been true about ISIS all along. I'm not necessarily disputing that, but all I'm saying is that claiming that it was ISIS or ISIS-K, as the Americans and the Western powers are doing, does not, even if it is correct, does not in itself mean that someone else might not have been involved and responsible in some way also. Now, we have the investigation going on. There's been an interesting article by Viedomosti, which is a Russian newspaper, and they are providing us with quite a lot of information about Russian suspicions and about the progress of the investigation. And I just get to read an extract from the article in Viedomosti. The US, UK and Ukrainian intelligence services may have been complicit in the terror attack on March 22nd, but the identities of the behind-the-scenes string pullers who ordered it have yet to be established. Russian Federal Security Service Director Alexander Bortnikov said on March 26th, that was to say yesterday. He added that the investigation is underway and authorities will continue to identify those who aided the perpetrators. According to the FSB chief, although the deadly terror attack on the Moscow outskirts appears to have been plotted and perpetrated by radical Islamists, Ukrainian intelligence may still have been involved. At this time, and now this is a direct quote, I can only say that we received preliminary information pointing to the engagement of that side, in other words, Ukraine, in organising this act. And we then go on to read, Bortnikov stressed that representatives of Ukrainian security structures had trained militants in the Middle East. After the terrorist attack was carried out, the Ukrainian side was ready to welcome the terrorists as heroes. This is Bortnikov speaking. Given this, the FSB head proposed designating the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, as a terrorist organization. And then Viedomosti goes on to say, on the same day, Russian Security Council Secretary Nikolai Patrushev said, Ukraine, of course, in replying to a journalist's question as to whether the ISIS or Ukraine was behind the tragedy. Now, as I said, these are comments. Viedomosti goes on to say, or at least experts working for Viedomosti who were contacted by Viedomosti go on to say that these are simply statements. One would need an awful lot more evidence before this connection was confirmed. But anyway, it's clear that the Russians think that Ukraine was involved, and we have Bortnikov telling us that they have some preliminary information pointing to the engagement of the Ukrainians in organising this act. I don't know what that information is. Let's wait and see. Now, there has been an important personnel change in Kiev over the last 24 hours. Alexei Danilov, the head of Ukraine's National Defense and Security Council, in other words, Zelensky's national security advisor, the man who fulfills something of the same role for Zelensky as Patrushev does for Putin. Anyway, Danilov has just resigned, been sacked, you take your choice. Like other top Ukrainian officials who are being dismissed at this time, he has been shuffled off and given a comfortable ambassadorship, this time in Norway. Now, the key thing to understand about Danilov is that just as Patrushev supervises Russia's intelligence community, it's assumed that Danilov does the same for Ukraine's intelligence community. And, of course, a lot of people in Russia especially are connecting these two events. They're saying that the Russians have captured these 4 gunmen. They have preliminary information pointing to Ukraine involved in organizing this act. That's what Bortnikov says. The gunmen were escaping towards the Ukrainian border. And straight after all of these allegations are made, we get information that the man in overall charge of Ukrainian intelligence, Danilov, has now been removed from his post. Now it is possible, perhaps it's what has happened, that Danilov has indeed been sacked, removed, forced to resign, whatever it is, because of his involvement or role in organising the Crocus City Hall attack. There is, I have to say though, another possibility, which is that Danilov recently made some extraordinarily rude and boorish comments about Li Hui, China's mediator, who has been travelling to Ukraine and to Europe, trying to get the Ukrainians to agree to sit down with the Russians and to try to negotiate an end to the war. Danilov, for example, apparently intentionally misspoke Li Hui's name. Now, I can very well imagine that the Chinese have complained to the Ukrainians about this. In fact, I'd be very surprised indeed if they didn't. I would guess that other officials within the Ukrainian government understand that it is extremely unwise to antagonize China at this time, and it may be that the Ukrainians, in response to this, decided that Danilov had to go. Having said that, I do wonder about this. Maybe an apology to China for Danilov's rude and crude comments would have sufficed. Actually dismissing a senior official in this fashion, if that's what has happened, does seem a very, very big act to make, merely because certain words were spoken. Anyway, I don't know exactly what is going on. I'm going to repeat again what I said before in an earlier program. This affair does have a contrived look to me. Perhaps Danilov has been sacked because he was in some way connected to it. I'm not saying, by the way, that that is the case. But in the West, the protestations of Ukrainian non-involvement have been so vehement and so identical, coming from multiple sources, that it does look to me like a coordinated campaign. And that makes me, frankly, suspicious. And I do wonder whether some people in the West have been alarmed about what has been going on and have contacted the Ukrainians and told them to clear up their act, and that it is this which explains why the director of the SBU came forward and made a clean breast of the previous murders that have taken place in Russia. Maybe it was an attempt to draw a line under all of that, and maybe Danilov, who perhaps is deeply implicated in all of these things, as a result, in response to the alarm in Western capitals about what happened at Crocus City Hall, maybe it was Western pressure that caused him to step down. Just my guess. Anyway, very interesting and remarkable affair, very disturbing affair at many levels. I must say that I'm getting more and more reports that a massive retaliation from Russia, or at least something very big by Russia against Ukraine, is being prepared. Now, that takes me back to the events on the battlefronts. We have had massive and repeated missile and drone strikes against energy facilities in Ukraine. And as of the time of making of this program, there is apparently a total power blackout in Kharkov, apparently a power blackout in Odessa, and there has also been a power blackout in Zaporozhye, though I'm not sure whether that is still taking place. Other Ukrainian communities are also suffering from very severe power shortages. And I have seen the results of the Russian missile attack on at least one Ukrainian power station close to Kharkov. Now, I remember that during the missile attacks on the Ukrainian energy system in 2022, 2023, the Russians were careful not to inflict significant damage on the power stations themselves. They attacked the distribution system rather than the power generation system. This time, judging by the pictures I've seen of this attack, they directly attacked at least one major power generating system, and they appear to have destroyed it utterly. This power station looks like it has been completely destroyed. They've also destroyed production facilities, energy production facilities, apparently in other places, including near that dam on the Dnieper, close to Zaporozhye. And it's important to say that these power production facilities cannot be repaired in any short period of time. We've also now had some comments from Yevgeny Belitsky, the governor of the Russian-appointed part, the Russian-controlled part of Zaporozhye region. And this is what Belitsky said: "We haven't begun anything yet, as our president once said. Our opponents should get accustomed to the thought that we have enough manpower and equipment to completely wipe out Ukraine's energy infrastructure." I'm saying this as a military pilot who was trained to destroy an enemy's industrial potential, as a pilot of the strategic missile carrying aviation. So what Belitsky said is that if Russia chose to, they could destroy the entirety of Ukraine's energy system. They have that capability. And we see that they are taking steps now which go beyond that which they were doing a year ago during their attacks on the energy system then. We have what look like semi-permanent blackouts, energy blackouts, in Kharkov, in Odessa, and in Zaporozhye. And as Belitsky says, quoting Putin, we haven't begun anything yet. They could do an awful lot more. And I think Belitsky is right. Note that he is very careful to say that he knows about this sort of thing because he was a former military pilot who trained as a pilot of strategic missile carrying aviation. So, huge missile attacks across Ukraine, major attacks on the energy system, and more going on the battlefronts. But before I turn to those, also continuous upgrading of Russia's missile forces. There's an article today in TASS which talks about development of the Onyx anti-ship missile. It's a supersonic system, and TASS says that Onyx supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles for Bastion mobile coastal defense systems will receive new active homing devices, allowing them to strike Ukrainian ground targets with greater precision. Initially designed as anti-ship missiles, Onyx has received the capacity of striking the adversary's ground-based facilities with greater precision due to its new active homing device. And then TASS says that another source added that simultaneously the work is underway to make Onyx invulnerable to Ukrainian electronic warfare equipment. So, Russians updating their missile systems all the time. Onyx has been used to strike at ground targets in Ukraine, principally in the Odessa region. The missiles are launched from Crimea and regularly strike Odessa, and one gets the sense that the Ukrainians have no real capacity to counter them. So, Onyx being modernized, missile strikes taking place. I ought to say, by the way, that in the missile strikes against Kharkov, the energy system in Kharkov, the air defense system, Ukraine's air defense system, seemed no longer to be operating. The same was true apparently in Zaporozhye. Perhaps the same is true of Odessa, though I would have thought, given its importance, that Odessa was better protected. But the battlefronts also, we're now starting to see further events which point to a deteriorating picture for the Ukrainians. Now, it's important to remember that we are now in the period of the Rasputitsa, the spring mud period, which is longer than in the autumn, because what is happening is that the snow and the frost melts with the spring sunshine, and it is this that turns much of the landscape into mud. And apparently we are now in the heaviest period of the Rasputitsa. The ground will start to harden from the middle of April and become fully hard by May. So the Russians have been able to conduct offensive operations throughout the Rasputitsa, and they're continuing to do so. But the probability is that the tempo is going to intensify from mid-April when the ground begins to harden. So what we're seeing at the moment is perhaps preparatory to the main events. And what is happening now, the most dramatic events that are happening now, continue to happen in this area of central Donbass. So, over the course of the last couple of hours, there's many, many more reports from the Avdiivka area of the Russians advancing westwards from Toninka and Orlovka. Less news, by the way, about what's going on in Berdichi. It looks as if the Ukrainians are in headlong retreat there, with the Russians pushing towards this river barrier. But it seems that they have already occupied ground north of Pervomaisky, of which they control perhaps 2/3, with the Ukrainians now increasingly vulnerable in that area of Pervomaisky that they do control. So, big Russian advance there, but the biggest and most dramatic events appear to be taking place in the Bakhmut area. So, about a week ago, the Russians captured Ivanivska, this village, fortified village, heavily fortified and well-defended village to Bakhmut's southwest. They have now apparently started a significant offensive from Bakhmut's northwest. There are reports that the Ukrainians are pulling out of Bogdanovka, or at least that the central part of Bogdanovka has now been, that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from it entirely, and that the Russians have occupied it. And there are also reports that the Russians south of Bogdanovka have now reached the outskirts of Chasov Yar, the part of Chasov Yar that is west of the canal. Now that's already pretty dramatic, especially given, as I said, that some of these movements are taking place across fields, which are probably quite muddy because of the Rasputitsa. But it's not the big events here. The big event is that the bombing and the missile strikes on Ukrainian positions is developing to a level of intensity that I've never seen, I think, at any previous point in this conflict since the special military operation began in February 2022. The Russians are carrying out relentless bombing and missile strikes right across the front line, but especially in particular locations to the rear of Ukrainian defences in the Bakhmut area, to the rear of Ukrainian defences in the Avdiivka area, in the rear areas right across Kharkov region. The attacks, the missile strikes on Kharkov, which have caused the blackouts, are only part of relentless Russian missile and bomb strikes right across Kharkov region that are intensifying, appear to be intensifying. And in Bakhmut, we've received a report that a major command post of the Ukrainian forces in Chasov Yar has been destroyed by an Iskander strike, that's a ballistic missile strike. And there are claims, which of course I can't remotely verify, that a Polish general and his staff were located in this bunker complex in Chasov Yar and were killed. And the general supposedly was Brigadier General Adam Marszak of the Polish Armed Forces. Now, I want to stress about this. I don't know that General Marszak was indeed killed in this strike. The Poles are saying that he died suddenly of natural causes. A number of people have pointed out that a surprisingly large number of senior NATO officers have died of natural causes recently. Well, that may be true, or it may not be true, or it might be a coincidence, or perhaps it's not. Again, I can't say. But anyway, these reports are indeed circulating. And it does look increasingly as if, well, it does indeed look as if a command centre of some kind was destroyed in the Kharkov region. Now, in its very latest report, the Russian Defense Ministry might allude to this because they're describing what happened over the course of 26th March, and they say that over the past 24 hours, that's to say 26th March, the armed forces of the Russian Federation delivered a group strike by long-range sea-based and ground-based precision-guided weaponry, and it looks as if, again, it's likely that this bunker complex, or possibly this bunker complex in Chasiv Yar, was one of the targets. So, major bomb strikes, major missile strikes, for one part across the entire front line, but my sense is principally now concentrated in the Donbass, central Donbass area, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Krasnogorovka, Marinka, Kharkov area, and also in Kharkov region, across Kharkov region. And, well, as I said many times, I'm no military expert, but it does look to me, what this all looks to me, is as if this is the kind of missile and bombing preparation which is being done in advance of some sort of offensive. I may be right, I might be wrong, I don't know, but that's how it is increasingly looking to me. Now, Sergei Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, has just given a further interview. He was asked to comment on the rumours that Russia intends to call up to announce a new mobilization drive, yet another conscription drive, like the one they carried out in autumn 2022. He said that was nonsense. He said it was stupidity, that the Russian armed forces have all the men they need to fulfill all the requirements of the special military operation, that in fact they actually have more men than they can deploy because there's still men going through training, and presumably there wouldn't be the training facilities to train even more. The Russians being careful to send trained men into battle. Anyway, the claim now is that 490,000 men have either joined volunteer formations or taken out contracts with the Russian military since the 1st of January 2023. Shoigu said that the Russian armed forces number 1.1 million men. The plan eventually is to bring them up to 1.5 million men. This process is well underway, and anyway, one way or the other, there is no need for a further mobilization. So that was from Shoigu, and he spoke rather confidently, and he spoke in ways that seemed to me to be of a sort that would be supported by the Russian generals. They look like they're supported by the Russian general staff. I remember that when talk of mobilization in Russia was in the air in the summer of 2022, on the eve of Ukraine's Kharkov and Kherson offensive. The Kremlin was repeatedly saying that there wouldn't be a mobilization, but the military was silent about it, and one got the impression that the military were not happy with the fact that a mobilization was being put off, whereas this time it is the military, not the Kremlin, who are saying that no mobilization is needed. So I get the sense that the Russian forces are increasingly well equipped and up to strength, that they're becoming bigger, whereas at the moment Ukraine's mobilization remains still stuck in the Ukrainian parliament. And apparently there's been discussions in Ukraine that are calling up men from the age of 25 would not produce a sufficiently big cohort to make up the numbers. They would need to call up men from the age of 18 or 19. A disastrous idea, by the way, cutting into Ukraine's teenage population to make up the numbers in the war, calling up very young men who have no experience of military matters at all, or at least none to speak of. As I said, it seems to me like a disastrous idea. I've discussed this many, many times. I doubt that it will be popular at all with Ukrainian society. And of course, there was that article recently in the Washington Post which says that mobilization in Ukraine has all but collapsed, and that it takes place on a fragmentary basis, depending very much on the energy and ruthlessness of the local recruiting stations. So perhaps we are moving forward towards some bigger event over the next few weeks and months. Maybe once the ground starts to harden in mid-April, we will see the Russians embark on some kind of ground offensive, with perhaps the focus on central Donbass and on and in Kharkov region. Events are starting increasingly, or so it seems to me, to support that theory. It is only a theory, however. I can't say it for a fact, but we did have that comment from Putin a couple of days ago, in which he said that the Russian army is now moving beyond active defense. Maybe that is another sign of things to come. Certainly, if it does come, Ukraine does not look in good shape to absorb the blow. We still get many reports about how short of men the Ukrainian army is. There's been a rather distressing documentary on the BBC. It contains many of the usual tropes and myths about the war, which I'm not going to waste time refuting. The claim of the Russian meat assaults, the vast superiority in manpower of the Russians, the fact that the Russians are prepared to throw away lives in human wave attacks, all of that kind of thing. But basically it does say that it does talk about a very difficult situation for the Ukrainians on the battlefronts. Perhaps the most startling thing is that when the BBC contacted certain Ukrainian units in order to carry out this programme, by the time the BBC was ready to make the programme, they found that the units were in such poor condition because so many of the men in them, serving in them, had been killed or wounded and were no longer serving, that it was impossible, basically, to make the program with those particular Ukrainian units. Anyway, I'm not going to dwell on this. The facts have been discussed many times, and they're well known. Ukraine is short of men, it's short of ammunition. The F-16 saga carries on. Denmark has just said that it's not prepared to supply Ukraine with more of its F-16s. The F-16s, anyway, are not due to appear before the midsummer. And as Brian Belletic has recently said in a programme, when they do appear, they will be too few and too late to make a difference. And we've now had desperate comments from Dmytro Kuleba, Ukraine's, in my opinion, highly incompetent foreign minister. Anyway, he's been begging, demanding more Patriot missiles, that Ukraine doesn't have the air defense coverage that it needs. If you follow events on the battlefronts closely, as I do, that is obvious. But they need, he says, more Patriot missiles. Always the Ukrainians come with these demands, I should say, with a colossal sense of entitlement from the West. But anyway, they say that they need more and more Patriot missiles. Of course, Kuleba is not acknowledging that part of the reason that that is so is because the Russians have destroyed so many of them. Just saying. But anyway, that is what Kuleba is asking for. And of course, the reality is that with Patriot missile systems in very short supply, with Patriot missile interceptors in extremely short supply, the West simply cannot meet Ukraine's needs in terms of missiles. Now, over the last couple of days, the rhetoric from the West about sending troops to Ukraine has died down. We're hearing less of this from Macron, for example. I think that the Americans and the Germans have basically killed that idea. The Pentagon has admitted that an appropriation, a routine appropriation that Congress has just made to provide security assistance to Ukraine, $300 million of it. This is not, by the way, part of the $61 billion that is still marooned in Congress, and it is not intended to supply weapons. It's intended to supply security assistance. One wonders what that means exactly. But anyway, the Pentagon says that this money which Congress has now authorized, cannot be spent because it was already spent in November. The Pentagon anticipated Congress's authorization, $300 million authorization, and spent the money in the autumn so that this money is no longer available. So, fewer weapons, fewer men, an air defense system that is breaking down, cities that are plunged in darkness, rumors of a huge offensive from the Russians coming. The Russians clearly now, I think, indicating that they strongly suspect Ukrainian involvement in the Crocus City Hall attack, signs of some kind of instability in Kiev with the sudden dismissal, unexplained dismissal, or resignation of Danilov. I come back again to the point I have been making. Even if Ukraine survives the next couple of weeks and months, which it probably will, I suspect that any offensive the Russians launch in Donbass and Kharkov region will not be the terminal blow. But the situation is now overall so bad that surely the moment has come for Ukraine to realize that Western promises are not going to be fulfilled, that they are empty air, that the situation is exactly what Professor Mearsheimer said all those years ago, back in 2015. Ukraine has been led up the primrose path to its own destruction. Surely the point has been reached for people in Ukraine to come to the logical conclusion and to contact the Russians and to say that the moment has been reached when they have understand that they have no other choice but to sit down and talk and agree with the Russians to whatever it is that the Russians are going to demand of them. Just saying. Well, again, I don't expect that to happen. Nikolai Petro, Professor Petro, whom we spoke to a few weeks ago, Glenn Deason and I, suggested that there could be some kind of change of government in Kiev, that a new government might take over and open negotiations. I have to say, I don't see any evidence of that at the moment. There was a lot of rumour about this whilst Zelensky and Zaluzhny were quarrelling with each other, but Zaluzhny, instead of leading the opposition to Zelensky, decided to accept the ambassadorship in London. So Zelensky's position, at least for the moment, looks rather more stable. But again, I think the point surely has come for Ukrainians to acknowledge the realities and to come to terms. Well, we'll see. Now, that basically concludes my discussion of the Ukraine-related issues in this program. Can I say that we're still waiting to see what the Russians are going to do over Crocus City Hall? If the Russians make an announcement that they do believe that the Ukrainians were involved, that will, of course, raise the stakes very much higher. I saw an article in Bloomberg which claims that even members of Putin's inner circle believe that the attack on Crocus City Hall was entirely the work of ISIS or of ISIS-K. I wonder how Bloomberg gets this information. I'm just saying, I gather they no longer have journalists in Moscow, and I do wonder whether members of Putin's inner circle would be talking to Bloomberg of all places. I said right at the beginning of this program that the West, in insisting that Crocus City Hall was only ISIS-K, are protesting too much, and maybe this article in Bloomberg, alongside the sudden disappearance of Danilov, are signs of gathering nerves. Anyway, we shall see. Dramatic events may be coming. There are some reports that the Russians have now finally begun their assault on Terny, on the Zherebets River, and about to storm it. There are also claims from various Russian officials. Our old friends Rogov and Saldo have been saying as much, that Rabotino, that the Russians are about to gain full control of Rabotino, and that this will happen within the next few hours. We'll see. But anyway, one way or the other, a very tense situation. And I get the sense that the nerves in the West and in Ukraine are fraying. Now, I do want to turn briefly again to the ceasefire resolution that passed the Security Council the other day. The United States, having abstained on the resolution, is now saying that this resolution is not mandatory. It clearly is mandatory. It makes demands. It doesn't ask. It doesn't say that it doesn't call for a ceasefire. It demands an immediate ceasefire. So clearly this is a mandatory resolution. The United States is trying to walk back its decision to abstain in the vote for this resolution. Quite a few people are saying that this is the Biden administration again playing games. They try to calm the Arab states, Muslim opinion, angry voters in Michigan by abstaining on this resolution and letting it pass. And then they try to win over their friends in Israel, will win back their friends in Israel and in the United States, Israel's friends in the United States, by reassuring them that actually this resolution really doesn't mean anything very much. What these kind of contradictory signals, to me, all that they show is an administration that is losing control. They're saying one thing one day, saying something completely different the other day. I don't think we should spend too much time analysing or over-analysing what this means. The fact is that the United States has had to sit back and allow a ceasefire resolution to pass the Security Council. It is not the end of the affair. We have a long way still to go. I completely understand those people who are exasperated with the delay. We say that tens of thousands of people have died, many more are dying still. Fighting continues, the humanitarian crisis continues. Palestinians can't wait for the Security Council to finally sort itself out and make a decision, and for the fighting to stop through those diplomatic means. I understand all of that. I still think that this is the most likely route to the outcome of a cessation of hostilities. And I think that probably we're going to start to see events move more quickly from this point onwards. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish today's video. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you can buy all sorts of amazing things: magic mugs, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.